Okay, I think we can start. Yes, I think there is a sufficient amount of people. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session of our Cosmos Talks. Today our guest is Cinzia Padovani, who's an associate professor at the College of Mass Communication and Media Arts at Southern Illinois University, but has been also with us for a while because she's conducting this research under a Marie Curie Experience Fellowship between the University of Loughborough and the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence on the far right and the media. I think she will offer a very interesting point of view on something. It is also part of what we study here in the department, coming more from the side of the study of communication. The format is the same that we always use. Okay, there will be a talk of around 35 40 minutes. Then there will be some brief comments on the talk. Today, Andrea Pirro will take care of that, and then we will open the floor for the discussion. Okay, I give the floor to Cinzia, and I turn my camera on so it doesn't disturb anyone.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to thank Professor Della Porta for giving me the opportunity to be a visiting fellow at Scuola Normale Superiore. During that time, between 2019 and 2020, I was able to do some of the field work and interviews with journalists that I will talk to you about today. Also, thanks to Dr. Lorenzo Zamponi for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity also to present here at Cosmos, and to the technical support. I will now upload my PowerPoint. I've done it. I've done it yesterday, so I hope you see it. Can somebody give me just a hint that you are seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Alrighty, so in many parts of the world, journalists tend to see themselves as playing an important role for the betterment of democracy and for the public sphere. The question is, what happens when journalists are faced with the question of whether to report, how to report, and if to report on anti-democratic actors or ultra-right actors? We can talk more about my choice of definition here, but extreme right, far right, anti-democratic actors. The dilemma is evident in the sense that whereas on one side, journalists, in particular political journalists, are supposed to report on anything that is politically relevant, on the other side, by reporting on it, they risk amplifying its significance and giving the so-called oxygen of publicity to actors who, if successful, could considerably disrupt democracies. This is the quandary from which this research takes its momentum. In this presentation, I develop a typology of journalists' positions based on the extant literature in journalism studies and studies of media and the alt-right. So I'm trying to bring together two fields, and then apply this methodology, or use this methodology, to sift through the interviews, semi-structured and in-depth interviews with 23 journalists, professional journalists in Italy. The questions that lead this research is, how do Italian journalists see their roles when faced with ultra-right actors? Do they envision themselves playing the typical, traditional journalistic role, the monitorial role? We'll talk more about that. Or do they envision new roles for themselves? This study opens up an original area of inquiry, which I hope has significance in cross-cultural and cross-country studies as well. We'll talk more about that in the at the end. Next, I want to just give you an overview of the model that I have developed to study the alt-right and the media. And in this, there are overlaps with the work that colleagues at Cosmos have been doing. One of the elements in this tripod is self-representation, media activism. I want to refer to the work of Professor Manuela Caiani and others, but also more recently the work of Froyo and others, and in particular their work on Casa Pound. Second prong in this three-pronged model is mainstream media representation. In fact, as also, and I'm referring to Gattinara and Froyo, 2018 publication. Of course, media representation is very important. Is very important for these social movements, these actors, to be able to have access to the media. So in my work is slightly, takes a different direction, but that's what we will be talking about in this presentation. And in particular, we will talk about journalists' roles, as I mentioned at the very beginning. Also because when we talk about mainstream media, mainstream media is obviously a plural term, a plural noun, but it's important to emphasize the plurality and the complexity of these institutions, which include a variety of practices, institutional practices, political economy practices, professional practices of newsmakers, including journalists. So very complex world to study, and as I said, my focus is on journalist study roles in this particular talk. And the third prong is the attention that certainly I want to dedicate next to the political policy dimensions, and in particular the discourse on social media regulations, while on media regulation in general, but certainly on social media regulations and ultra-right speech. We can talk about this if you have any questions later on in questions and answers, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the overall model that I'm working from. So let's go into the study for today, the role of journalists and the ultra-right. As I mentioned to you, I'm bringing together at least two fields. Let's start with the field of journalism studies, which is a very broad, large field. Before we do that, though, I want to give you an outline. We'll talk about these roles and the ultra-right, and I will develop a typology based on the extant literature in journalism studies and ultra-right and the media. And then we'll talk about the methodology, the interviews that I have done, and some observations and reflections before closing with the conclusions. The journalism studies, this first field that, as I said, is wide-ranging, cross-national, provides us with a set of general conceptual analytical tools, does not focus in particular on issues related to far right or extreme right or ultra-right, but certainly gives us overall conceptual and analytical tool, in particular when it comes to roles. the roles of journalists, or journalists in particular, normative roles as well as cognitive roles, normative roles, which represent the set of framework of desirable practices for journalists, the expectations that journalists themselves have with regard to what is normatively acceptable. And then the cognitive roles, the journalist's own professional aspiration and ambitions. Cognitive and normative roles both contribute to orienting journalistic practices. I also want to say that traditionally this role is framed, the journalist role, one of the most important role is within the tenets of the public sphere model. I am well aware of the controversies surrounding the notion of the public sphere, and also the framing of journalism within the public sphere. I refer here to the work of Karen Wall-Jurgensen and Tonish Hanisch, for instance, and the original work of Barbara Zelitzer, who really criticized this centrality of the public sphere for journalism, for being ethnocentric, for narrowing down the parameters of journalistic inquiry, and for marginalizing or under-theorizing other aspects of forms of journalism. However, for the point of this particular study, the framework of democracy in the public sphere is still very important, also because very recent work by Reif highlights that this remains a very important role among the self-perception of journalists, not only in mature democracies, but also in other places of the world, including the global south. And then we go into the field of ultra-right and the media. I've already discussed, although briefly, Gattinara and Froio. I could also highlight the work of Ruth Wodak from a very different critical discourse analytical point of view. Both Gattinara and Froio and also Wodak highlight, seem to frame the issue of mainstream media representation of the ultra-right as being one that is almost reactive to what these actors put in place and their mobilization strategies in the case of Gattinara and Froio, or discursive strategies, as is the case with Ruth Wodak. But I want to put the focus on the choices that mainstream media, including journalists, have in the roles that they can inhabit with regard to how to report, whether to report, and how, if to report on ultra-right anti-democratic actors. And so here I'm referring in particular to the work of Bart Commerce. I mentioned at the very beginning, or at one point, that journalism studies is a wide-ranging and cross-national field that gives us a lot of conceptual analytical tools, whereas instead studies of media and the ultra-right, and here I'm referring in particular to the work of Commerce, are much more focused and much more prescriptive and normative in their positioning. Commerce has written on various occasions about the role of the ultra-right, the role of the media, mainstream media, in the coverage of the ultra-right. In his earlier work in the mid-2000, late 2000, Commerce emphasized the importance of deplatforming or no platforming. In other words, the mainstream media should not give attention to ultra-right actors. More recently, instead, Bart Kamertz has revisited some of his positions, and highlighted a few roles here: accommodating, deriding, and ostracizing, and then advocating for a rebirth of the public journalism tradition. Before moving to the next slide, I want to give some better understanding of what accommodating, deriding, and ostracizing means according to Kamertz. So accommodating happens when journalists and news media treat ultra-right, extreme right actors as if they were any other actor, and treat their beliefs on par with other ideologies. According to Kamertz, when news media do that, there is a process of normalization that comes into play, and I would add also a process of legitimation that comes with that. Accommodating ultra-right actors can happen when journalists take a very monitorial, neutral, or equidistant position with regard to ultra-right or extreme right actors. We will see what I mean by that later on in the analysis of the interviews, but that's one of the concerns that Kamertz has. And then he says there are journalists who deride, who are derisive. And by deriding the alt-right, however, the news media may belittle its significance and minimize attention to it. Ostracizing the alt-right is also, problematic because it might fuel a certain, the victim position of some of these actors. So Kamertz advocates the rebirth of the public journalism tradition. Now, the public journalism tradition has a long history, started in the United States of America in the 1980s, and was very much present in that country in the 1980s and 1990s. Is a kind of tradition that perhaps we can connect to the role of journalists that also in Italy and in other countries was stronger earlier on, like advocacy journalism, a kind of journalism according to which journalists are active participants in public life. When Professor Hans-Jörg Trenz came to speak to Cosmos exactly a year ago, he mentioned, he made a mention to some of these, maybe not exactly the same concepts, we are very interdisciplinary here, and made a mention of constructive journalism. Perhaps that could be another way to look at this public journalism tradition. So this is the typology of roles that I highlighted, that I came up with after looking at the literature and also adding some elements to that literature as well. So 5 main roles. Possible potential roles. There is even the favorable. So on top and the bottom, you can see on top a favorable role, bottom complete deplatforming, ostracizing ultra-right or extreme right actors. Favorable, we cannot go because time does not allow us to really go into what this role could be, but suffice to say that the journalist might present the alt-right in favorable terms. This doesn't need to be done in a very overt way. If we look at, for instance, at critical discourse analysis, the work of Rolf Wodak, who I just mentioned earlier, but also Teun van Dijk, we would see that A journalist could do that, or just by, for instance, emphasizing what is good about some of the activities that alt-right actors do, for instance, soup kitchens or cleaning monuments, or I don't know, some small community engaged activities that they could do, and undermine or de-emphasize what their underlying motivations might be. The other roles here is the monitorial role. I mentioned that already, is the most important, historically traditional role of the political journalist in a democracy, in a public sphere, in that concept of the public sphere, but also, as we said, more and more among journalists elsewhere, not just in mature democracies. Monitorial means that the journalist adopts a very neutral and detached, as I mentioned here earlier, positioning towards, the social field. Is equidistant from the various actors. Ideally, of course, this is the roles of journalists. And then there is the public journalist role, where the journalist stands up, as we apply it to alt-right actors, stands up in favor of the community, stands up to alt-right actors, and then the derisive and deplatforming, deny any platform to the ultra-right or the extreme right. Deny any platform on mainstream media, but also work towards deplatforming on social media as well. The research questions for this study, we already went through them, so I'm not going to focus on this now, and we can move into the methodology that I implemented. So, as we said, roles are discursive constructions, and they are, as Barb Zelizer wrote, created by journalists as interpretative communities. And metaphors, for instance, are very commonly used to refer to the role of journalists. Think, for instance, of the role of the watchdog, very historically very important metaphor for the role of the journalist in the public sphere. Thus, qualitative methodologies, in this particular case, interviews, are fit, the object of the study, and there are also a lot of examples in the literature of interviewing journalists. Certainly, interviewing journalists has its own difficulties. This is a professional class that is typically very busy. They are also artists of, before we go here, actually, they are artists of the use of metaphors, and of language in general. So it takes a particular focus. I interviewed 23 journalists, and here is my list of respondents. I want to say that the interviews were conducted over a period of 6 months, started in October 2019 until early May 2020. You can imagine that the last few months, the interviews were only on Zoom and other online platforms. The selections of respondents was made according to the so-called multi-start snowballing technique, which began with 3 key informants, previous contacts that I had within the National Federation of the Italian Press, a couple of contacts one contact in the National Federation of the Italian Press, one inside RAI, the Italian public broadcaster itself, and another contact in academia. I then augmented the sample, so that's why it's a multi-start snowballing sample. I augmented the sample by tapping a list of journalists who had authored news articles on the ultra-right. Of course, this was the condition of these interviews, of these respondents, that they had to have worked on ultra-right issues or covered ultra-right. And then finally, I generated additional contacts by following some of my respondents' social media networks on Twitter in particular. This was a very interesting way to generate this sample. Of course, there are problems in this sample. This is not statistically significant. It's just a sample for in-depth interviews. The gender is very imbalanced, and also the age. I really made a lot of effort here to include, to be more multi-gender, or at least include more females. However, both the gender and the age imbalance, unfortunately, reflect in so many ways also the structure of the newsmaking industry in Italy. The positions are all the way from very young freelance journalists to well-known talk show hosts, to journalists who have been editors-in-chief, senior editors of various media outlets. I also made a point of trying to include a variety of political orientations in the news outlets that that my journalists have worked with. So let's go into the analysis of the interviews. So I decided to analyze these interviews through the metaphors, to focus on the metaphors that journalists themselves had used. I should premise this by saying that I transcribed and translated relevant pieces of these interviews from Italian into English, and that also altogether the data were about 240 pages in a Word document. The most important roles here, not surprisingly from one point of view, is that the monitorial role is central for sure, but also that the public, or what I have defined the following commerce, the public journalist is certainly present, and the derisive journalist is also there. I will go through each one of these roles, and then after each presentation of each of these roles, I will also provide examples of media texts, embodiments, if you will, of how each one of these roles then becomes an actual media text, because we are talking about the media, and therefore media texts are very important. Well, the first is the monitorial role. Typical traditional role. Here I want to say that the metaphor of the observer, for instance, is is a more typical metaphor that we see in cross-country studies like the ones I was referring to earlier on in this presentation by Hanish and others in their groundbreaking world of journalism studies that just came out in 2019. So the observer, the one who tells it as it is. The host instead, I would say that is less prominent in the kind of metaphors reported in the literature. I should also say that the world of journalism is based on more, is a large study. So questionnaires with journalists working in over 43 countries, I think, in the world, whereas the use of direct and in-depth interviews, of course, should give us the opportunity to see what new insights, what new metaphors might emerge. So I think the host could be one of them. The journalist who represented himself, in this case, this was a male, was emphasized the fact that he was open to all actors. As journalists, they have to be open to all and really welcome everybody and listen to everybody. Another journalist who is a veteran journalist for a famous Italian newspaper who covered Forza Nuova, one of the alt-right actors in Italy, in Rome for many, many years. She said that although we need to have this, we are monitors, right? Journalists are, but at the same time, we also need to keep an eye to the balance of reality. And this was in particular in reference to mobilization, to when these actors mobilize in the streets. And as Gattinara and Froglio rightly emphasize, it seems that, in their study, there is indeed a correlation between when these actors go in the streets, mobilize in the streets, and then the reporting that happens. Well, this journalist said that, it's the editorial line of their newspaper to cover these actors only if they get into the streets and only if they have a certain size of mobilization, but also it's important to always keep an eye to the balance of reality. In other words, she mentioned the importance of context. So in all this reporting that she would do, always avoid a focus, single focus on the mobilization, for instance, but expand the focus to more contextual knowledge. When I asked to the host, my journalist host, whether he would interview these actors, my host journalist responded that, of course, yes, he would interview these actors. He would even interview Benito Mussolini if Mussolini was alive. But in reality, the issue of interviewing these actors, so interviews as a particular journalistic tool, was debated in the data, and we can talk more in questions and answers, because in reality, doing, for instance, profile interviews, or as Ruth Wodak wrote in her analysis of how mainstream media react to alt-right actors, giving them the microphone or using quotes from interviews can be very problematic, also because it gives them the stage. It gives them the ability to frame the narration. So I want to show you some media text, as I promised earlier. After each role, I will show you some media text that comes from a previous study that I did prior to this, in which I analyzed the discursive construction of Forza Nuova on Corriere della Sera, and found a number of profile interviews on Corriere della Sera. These are done in particular when some of these people that you see here on these pictures are candidate themselves for Forza Nuova, for groups, alliances, together with Forza Nuova in various towns in northern Italy. We cannot go into the discursive analysis of these interviews, but just visually, we can, if you want, in questions and answers, we can go through the turn taking of these interviews. The fact that each title, each headline has the words of the candidate. This is a Forza Nuova candidate in quotation marks, therefore giving them really a lot of importance. But also simply by looking at these samples, which, as I said, comes from a previous study, we can see the pictures, for instance, the profile pictures that seem to normalize these candidates, right? These actors. It's a little bit what Bart Commerce had said earlier on, and we mentioned earlier on regarding the neutral style, a detached and equidistant style of journalism in which we interview everybody, we are open to everybody, we treat everybody like any other actor, but by doing that, we tend to normalize and perhaps legitimize certain actors in the public sphere. A second set of role is the public journalist. And this came very loud and clear in the data of the interviews, although there are slightly less number of journalists that I would define as inhabiting the public journalist role as compared to the Monitorial. But this metaphor really made, really illustrated the importance of this role, how strong certain journalists feel the role to be. So not simply reacting. So mainstream media are a complex set of practices, and journalists' roles are also quite complex. So the media, mainstream media, or some parts of them, don't simply react to what these actors do, but there's a lot of reflection behind what happens. So like the physician must cure an illness and must take and intervene with a knife, for us, for journalists, and the knife is the denunciation, documentation, verification, etc. Another interesting metaphor here is to let any latent form of fascism for this particular journalist, who is one of the very few editor-in-chief of an Italian magazine, who is a woman. Fascism, the definition has to be expanded, and of course we can't just refer to historical fascism, but we need to look at the latent forms of contemporary fascism, and we need to make them emerge. I'll give you an example, and this is an example of that kind of journalist physician. This particular magazine, Left, which really doesn't mean left, but means liberty, I think, equality, fraternity, and transformation. The issue on the left of your screen, come farla finita con il fascismo, a famous phrase, how to end fascism, and the other one, il fascismo non è un'opinione, è un crimine. Fascism is not an opinion, but it's a crime. Right before I went to interview this journalist, these two issues of this journal, of this magazine left, had come out, and I actually did not even know it. So these are some examples of the journalist physician. Other metaphors that are used when we talk of public journalism is digging out what is concealed, very similar to what we said, emerging, letting emerge, bring to the surface what is hidden, racism, Islamophobia, sexism, etc., elements of that, of some of those alt-right ideologies, and shedding light. Shedding light really speaks to, contrary to the deplatforming or not platforming position, and that's a position that a very well-known journalist, Paolo Berizzi for Repubblica, does, and he's actually under police protection, has been for quite some time, with a rubric on with books and undercover work for many years with extreme right groups. But what he does in this rubric for La Repubblica, daily rubric, is exactly shedding light. In other words, we need to shed light, although never giving interviews, I would say, on the part of Paolo Berizzi. The public journalism and anti-fascism. So anti-fascism also came up as an important element of this, of what I have defined as maybe falling in the public journalist role, anti-fascism. This was interesting because interesting for various reasons, including the fact that the person who mentioned this anti-fascism as an important value of journalism is the youngest in my sample, and so he's like 28, 27, and he also emphasized, and he's a very precarious journalist, although already under police protection for the undercover work he has done on the ultra-right in his part of Italy, and he said that anti-fascism is not a political position, but rather it's a civic position, and thus has to imbue the work of journalists. And actually, he indeed has done a lot of interesting work underground. He has so investigative and underground journalism is very valuable in this regard, shedding light. And I want to say also a couple of words about underground or undercover, I should say, sorry, undercover journalism is not the preferred modus operandi of journalists, but as some of the people I interviewed who did a lot of undercover reporting, is that if you it might be the last option that you have if you cannot for the sake of democracy, if you need to report on these groups. And then the last group, the derisive journalists. Well, we have seen this tendency to define, even Benito Mussolini himself was defined a buffoon, and then we have seen that going on. I mean, maybe repeatedly, media tend to refer to some of these actors as buffoons, or in Italy, for instance, fascismo pop. They are authentic buffoons. They are caricatures. It's a pseudo-fascist imagery, a fascistata, told me one of my respondents. It's a mise-en-scene, and last, it's a waste of time, an insignificant pursuit, which obviously you can imagine how sad that made me feel. When I was doing my interviews, to be told that was a waste of time, but after all, these are data. So some examples. Some examples is Fascismo Pop by Ceccarelli, Filippo Ceccarelli, a senior editor for La Repubblica, who really emphasizes in his writings the funny sort of pop cultural element, which of course is present. And once again, I refer to the work of Froyo and others, including their most recent work on Casa Pound. There is clearly that element of popular culture, and media latch on to that element as well. Okay, some discussion. So going back to the roles that I had highlighted earlier on, based on the literature, now using that kind of framework to organize my data from the interviews, nobody, obviously, I would say, openly supported a favorable role for journalists. As I said, that can be better defined through critical discourse analysis or other critical methodology of analyzing media texts. And then nobody supported deplatforming or ostracizing. I'm doing some work now. I'm starting interviews with British journalists. And although I'm still at the very beginning of my interviews with these journalists, I can tell already that instead, the no platforming movement of the 1970s, which was very strong in the UK, and then the deplatforming advocacy that is being championed by organizations like Hope Not Hate in the UK, can be seen in some of the interviews that I've done. In other words, I expect that as I move into an open study and study this a bit more comparatively, I think I might see more positions towards deplatforming in the UK than here in Italy. And then there is, of course, the monitorial role. We saw that again, the public and derisive. Of course, I only have 23 interviews, which it's a good number for in-depth interviews, but doesn't land to statistics. However, I will still provide some observations. The monitorial role is the most heterogeneous in terms of the political leanings of my journalists here. Heterogeneous in the sense that there were people working for center left, center right, news outlets, and this does not surprise me. All middle-aged and older are those who supported this role, and the majority are men, but of course I have very few women in the sample, so that doesn't really say much. The public journalist role, the gender composition is more balanced. Of the 5 women, 3 were in this group. The political orientation is much more homogeneous in that we see that everybody who works for a left-wing news organization, I want to say that all those who inhabit this role work for left-wing organizations, news organizations. They're younger, the job positions are more heterogeneous, from freelance to established journalists. And then the derisive role, most homogeneous in terms of demographics, all males, but all older, over 65, political orientation also homogeneous right and center right. Conclusions. Well, the conclusions here is that the question of which roles journalists inhabit when faced with ultra-right actors and the dilemma of how and whether to cover such actors are complex and need to be studied in a variety of national contexts and across countries. The role of journalists, which is traditionally understood to be in the service of democracy, is under question when faced by actors who, on one hand, claim a public space on the basis of democratic principles of free speech and the right to fair representation, and on the other, express ideologies that are against the universality of those very democratic values. And so journalists find themselves in a conundrum. If they report on the alt-right, they give them visibility. If they don't, newsmakers could be accused of not doing their job of informing the public. This is a problem that journalists face both within countries and internationally, as alt-right actors have acquired increasing visibility in various national contexts. What roles do they inhabit? What factors define their roles? What similarity and differences might exist, comparing the Italian experience with cross-national comparisons as well, can be done, obviously, using different methodologies, because clearly in-depth interviews give us a lot of in-depth and rich data, but perhaps more difficult to apply to large studies. With regard to the British journalist project that is going on, I think I already gave you some ideas. I think that one most important element in different perceptions of roles is going to be also the history of journalism, the structural situation of the newsmaking industry in a given country, and also, of course, the history of ultra-right actors in that country. And last but not least, the presence of far-right mainstream political actors in a given country as well, because that clearly has also an impact on the roles that journalists can play. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Cinzia, really for the very interesting presentation. I guess we can go towards the debate part of our talk. So first of all, I give the floor to Andrea Pirro for some introductory comments and questions, and then we can broaden the debate.
Yes, well, thanks very much, Lorenzo. Thanks very much, Cinzia, for this very timely presentation on the role of the media in relation to the far right. We're facing this discussion, especially in the face of what we've learned to be the demise of Forza Nuova just yesterday, which is no more and is now building alliances with new actors within the electoral arena. So given the resonance that this piece of news has attracted, this is even more salient to discuss such topics. I've been asked to do the honors at the very last minute, so I should probably say that unfortunately I'm not a student of journalism, so I hope I can chip in at least from the perspective of research of far-right politics. The sort of ideas that came to mind whilst following your presentation have to do with the, first of all, with the typology you come up with. And I was wondering whether you could perhaps define something more parsimonious and perhaps slightly more neutral. And related to this, question, I was wondering whether you were familiar with the work of Leonie de Jonge on Benelux countries. That resonates a lot with your work. She has an article that appeared in the International Journal of Press Politics in 2018 and a forthcoming monograph on Routledge, where she frames media responses in terms of demarcation, confrontation, and accommodation, basically adapting the work of Minkenberg and other scholars on mainstream party responses to the media sphere. Then, of course, your presentation begs the question of the broader context. Of course, the media and the far right do not operate in a vacuum. So broadening the picture to account for the structure of the media landscape on the effects that these may exert on the far right seems quite compelling. And in this regard, the work of Antonis Edlinas comes to mind. Of course, you kind of anticipated some of my questions, and I was wondering to what extent or whether actually a comparative design could add further leverage to your findings. How does this scenario that you depicted in relation to the Italian case compare or relates to less electorally successful or less media savvy actors of other countries, for instance? Finally, and of course, there's the question of to what extent is the role of journalists and the exposure given to the far right a byproduct of the electoral performance of the far right and the broader dynamics of party competition, or even since we're hosting this presentation at Cosmos, to what extent are they a byproduct of counter mobilization dynamics? This should, in principle, help locate the media and define the role of the media along the causal chain, if you wish to, start discussing these issues along these lines. And I think these were some thoughts that could perhaps propel a little bit of, or spark a little bit of discussion, but I'll leave the word to Lorenzo for this. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. Cinzia, do you want to say something straight away, or do we open the floor for more questions?
Sure. I can say something straight away. Thank you so much, Andrea. I would like thank you for the literature references, and I will look it up for sure. I would like to ask you also what you mean by a more parsimonious and neutral typology, because I was not clear about that in particular. With regard to the broader context, as well, absolutely the structural elements of the media, for instance, Italian journalists are well positioned within the Monitorial role, but also what Worlds of Journalism defines accommodating role, which is not the accommodation that Barker-Merz talks about, but it's in other words, given the highly competitive and commercial media environment, journalists also have to compete for audiences, and so that they have to accommodate to audiences, and so that too has to be taken into consideration. The more comparative work absolutely will add leverage to this study. This was a small study in some regards to gather some insights, some depth to this discussion. less whether so the less electoral successful and less media savvy, less media savvy actors, right? Probably you were referring, Andrea. So, for instance, now in the analysis, for instance, of a group like Forza Nuova, which is very small, although very interesting because it's a long-lived small party, has had some experiences or has candidates or at least expressed some in electoral, in administrative elections. And indeed, in my analysis of the media coverage or the discursive construction, so I want to separate a little bit here. I'm not simply looking at coverage in say, but the discursive construction of the actors on this on major news organizations, we see clearly that that when Forza Nuova presents itself or allies itself with for competition, for electoral competition, there is more attention, and the examples I gave of those interviews should also come from that more attention. Forza Nuova, compared to a much more media savvy Casa Pound Italia, is not very exciting from the point of view of media activism. But there is also another thing that we need to say, and that is that for some of these actors, or for some of the critical literature that I am familiar with, which I understand is, might be different. The electoral success or the electoral competition is only one element, but what we need to look at is, especially in the case of anti-democratic actors such as the ultra-right or neo-fascism in general, is even just the question of why do they exist, and their mere existence is of interest. Besides electoral success. Counter-mobilization dynamics. So, Andrea, here I think you were referring, for instance, to Antifa, probably, or other, or for instance, in Italy, the mobilization of the anti-fascists in general, even the more historical and anti-fascism. Clearly, this has an impact on the quantity of coverage, and also on some of the framing of this coverage, because if we look at how these actors are covered, and here I'm referring to the earlier work I've done on media coverage or media discursive analysis, discursive construction, we see a clear framing of mobilization and counter-mobilization, of fights of extreme right versus extreme left, radical right versus radical left. So that is very present. And in my discussions with the journalists, they are aware, and some of them do not, would like to move away from this oppositional framing as well. But that counter-mobilization is certainly an element in coverage. Thank you.
Thank you, Cinzia.
Okay, thanks a lot. So we can now open the floor for some more questions. Who wants to start? Manuela.
First of all, thank you, Cinzia, and thank you for your presentation that I followed only the very last minute, but I have been able to read your works in other occasions. Therefore, thank you for this participation, and this is also an occasion for me to say hello, welcome back, although virtually. So my question is very little, or probably only partially addressing your topic. I was wondering if, okay, you in your presentation, this research is about, as you said, the media coverage and discourse construction of the actors. And I was wondering if you, beyond working on written text, like newspaper articles, you were perhaps considering also the idea of including as sources for the analysis visual materials. I came across some articles, let's say, recently that were focusing on, for instance, the power of memes, so the images, the memes, so the misleading memes, the power of memes, especially in the propaganda of extreme right actor. There is a very nice paper written by also a co-author of Andrea Pirro, of Klein from the UI, exactly on the memes and in visual production of information by the British National Party. So this to say, of course, you are addressing the topic from a different perspective, not only in terms of sources, but also in terms of actors. But I mean, did you have in mind this point about the images and visual materials, and in your case, how this could be used to continue to be integrated in this research? It would be very, very interesting to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuela. Very nice to see you again, although virtually. And thank you for your question, which actually is very important. Certainly beyond written text, I've done some work on social media and on various platforms. The memes, I've seen some of the work, and I will certainly look into that more. These are particularly interesting also when we come to look at groups like, for instance, the QAnons, the Q Anonymous, that is really becoming very powerful on starting with 4chan and 8chan in the US and spreading on various channels. For instance, I try to follow them on Telegram, and there is very little written. It's mostly on the small videos that they produce, and of course the memes as well. So definitely that we need to go beyond the written text to understand the complexity of this. Also, I wanted to ask you, Manuela, about the British National Party. You said something about the British National Party. Can you tell me again? I didn't get it.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, this one of these few, actually, empirical works, empirical papers on memes that I have read was by Oprah Klein, and it was focusing on the this visual discourse of visual propaganda of the British National Party. So Oprah in this paper tried to also offer a classification of fake news through images that are produced by the British National Party. So, but this was just it is just a paper. I mean, if you want, I can send it to you. But as you correctly said, unfortunately, there are not many empirical studies yet which work systematically, let me say, with visual communication from journalists and or by extreme right, in this case, extreme right actors. So in my view, this of course, what is the problem is that it is, even when we talk about frames, it is very difficult to elaborate categories, for categorizing images in terms of, for instance, misleadingness and other concepts.
Absolutely, yes. Still, at the same time, it certainly needs to be done. There are also some great software that we can use to analyze, at least thematically, but obviously there is the issue of coding, as you said, which is not easy. I will certainly look into this study on the visual propaganda of the British National Party as well. Thank you so much, Manuela.
Thanks a lot. Someone else wants to ask something?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Angela.
Okay. See, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was really interesting, and also like the theme is compelling, really. I was wondering, just a very short question, whether you were thinking about including in the sample local journalists and not just journalists that have national coverage, especially like in relation to the specificity of ultra-right groups that are not always directly related to institutional politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. This is a really important question, actually. And you are absolutely right. It is in the ways in which these actors work at the local level, not only the ways in which they work at the local level, that makes talking with local journalists very important. But also the fact that typically local journalism might be even less structurally strong than national journalism, because obviously journalists working for small news organizations, there might be a whole set of problems there, including training and professionalism. I can tell you that the example that I was giving earlier about favorable reporting, which is one of my roles in my typology, I was expressively thinking about some local journalism that I've not studied systematically, but I have looked at their headlines in a certain period of time, and those headlines really make me think that at that level of the local level, the emphasis on soup kitchens or Casa Pound bringing food to a family or Casa Pound cleaning a certain little park corner that had been left aside, that emerged in particular in this local news organization. So I think that your point is very well taken, and definitely something that I would want to follow up. Thank you, Angela.
Other questions? Well, if there is no one else, I would like to ask something regarding what you were just saying about the soup kitchens and all a series of activities that are often portrayed in the media whenever we hear about far-right movements. With Lorenzo Bosi, we've conducted a research project some time ago on direct social action in the context of the economic crisis in Italy, analyzing how different actors brought forward different kind of initiatives in the context of the crisis, and we were obviously also focusing on radical right organization, although it was a minoritarian component of our sample. And obviously, we had to deal with the fact that there is a quite established media narrative about that. And from the interview, it came out very clearly that they are very aware of that, and that this narrative component becomes really the structural element of these initiatives. We've seen that in general, okay, these kind of initiatives are used by every kind of actors as a way to enhance their own credibility. But obviously this is much more important than usual in cases of far-right groups, because they have obviously a threshold of credibility to reach which is higher than other kinds of actors. So for them, really to focus on this becomes really important. So the question I would like to ask you, from the point of view of your own research, or the point of view on how journalists see this, okay, how do you deal with that? Because often I have the feeling that there is a stereotypical story. The left has abandoned the working class neighborhoods. Now only the neo-fascist groups are the ones organizing these kind of initiatives. And obviously this is, on the one hand, it is laziness on the part of media operators, of really investigating how significant these are, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, obviously there might be the will by journalists to say something which is perceived as I don't know, innovating, against the grain, or something like that. And I really would like to know what you think about that.
Thank you. Yeah, well, so the fact that these organizations and these actors know how, especially local media, might work, right? And the logics of reporting, going back to what Angela was suggesting, it reflects clearly their their awareness and their need for more legitimacy, as you mentioned. The laziness of the media. So the journalist that I mentioned to you earlier on in this presentation, who covered Forza Nuova since the beginning of Forza Nuova, since Forza Nuova had just been established, so 1997, 1998. When she mentioned, and now she has gone on to better things, but she's covered Forza Nuova for many, many years. And so when she was saying we need to pay attention to the balance of reality, I think that is what she was telling us to pay attention to. As you said, Lorenzo, there is this narrative that working class neighborhoods have been abandoned. We need to expand our frame to also, as journalists, to also pay attention to other organizations, other groups, other activists in that particular environment that are doing things. And so what this particular journalist was telling me is to pay attention to the balance of reality, to the contextual elements, and also to other actors that might be opposing or might be doing work in the neighborhood. I also interviewed various people who work for Il Manifesto, which has a clear political stance. and they, you know, they are very aware of this and very aware of giving more visibility to those who are doing things in the neighborhoods and are not this kind of actors. So how to report is the question here, because on one side, events, especially when they are street mobilizations or confrontations, seem to have to be reported, but also widening the scope of reporting and including other groups, other activism that is going on in that particular context. But this also has to do with your editor, you know, with the kind of job. For instance, I interviewed also people working for L'Espresso. They have carta bianca in regard to how wide and how in depth they go, and they have been doing some incredible investigative work on these organizations. But obviously, the structural constraints, the structural situation that they experience is very different from a reporter for, say, the local page, the local section of even Corriere della Sera. So I don't know if I responded to your questions, but thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Okay, then. I think then we can end our session here. Thanks a lot to Cinzia for being our guest today. Obviously, we had planned this talk for some months ago.
Yes, yeah, for
we
almost
had
a
two
year.
different waves of the pandemic disrupting it, but we finally got to have it, and I'm really happy about that. Thanks also to Andrea Pirro for the comments, and to everyone for participating. I also to remind you that this session was recorded, so we will have also the chance to watch it and spread it to anybody who could be interested in listening to it. Thanks a lot, and see you at our next session next year at this point.
Thank you very much. Thank you.